Good morning and welcome to Learning Thursdays. My name is Crystal Hewitt-Gill and I'm with the OASAS Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. The presentation for today is titled Sex Worker Sensitivity for SUD Treatment Providers. And our presenters are Dr. Jill McCracken and Magali Lerman. Dr. McCracken is an Associate Professor of Rhetoric at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and the co-founder, co-director of Sex Workers Outreach Program, or SWOP, Behind Bars, an organization that provides community support for incarcerated sex workers and connects them to the sex worker rights movement. Having worked with sex workers and victims of trafficking for over 14 years, her primary areas of research focus on sex work and trafficking in the sex industry, women in incarceration, and the impact of sexuality education on marginalized communities. Drawing on ethnographic and qualitative research methods, Dr. McCracken integrates community-based, participatory research into her work. She recently completed a Fulbright Specialist project in collaboration with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective that focused on how to prevent violence and trafficking in sex work, as well as the ways in which legislative models enhance or impinge on sex workers' health, safety, and well-being. She is currently working on the Adolescent Sexual Health Education and Research, or ASHER project, with youth in high-risk situations to better understand and prevent exploitation and violence. Magali Lerman, who uses the pronouns she, they, is co-founder and partner with Reframe Health and Justice. As a person in long-term recovery and former survival sex worker, Magali has dedicated her career to supporting people who use drugs and people who trade sex through capacity-building assistance, community education, advocacy, and community-based research. Previously, they served as co-director of Praxis, development director at the Harm Reduction Action Center, and drug user health fellow with the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. Currently, Magali is acting board president of the Sex Workers Outreach Project USA. She received her BA in an individualized degree program from Metropolitan State University of Denver. They will be joining us in just a moment, but first a word about Learning Thursdays. Learning Thursdays are offered to behavioral health professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge and skills of the New York State substance use disorder workforce. As we strive to improve the lives of individuals needing prevention, treatment, and recovery services. A goal of Learning Thursdays is to support the professional development of the treatment, prevention, and recovery workforce. We do this by offering regular presentations that are relevant to today's substance use disorder treatment professionals. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to contact us at the Learning Thursdays mailbox. You can use the same mailbox to express an interest in providing a future Learning Thursdays program. Before the presentation formally starts, I want to take a moment to discuss the STR TA program. SAMHSA's State Targeted Response Technical Assistance Consortium assists STR grantees and other organizations by providing the resources and technical assistance needed to address the opioid crisis. Technical assistance is available to support the evidence-based prevention, treatment, and recovery of opioid use disorders. The STR-TA Consortium provides local expertise to communities and organizations to help address the opioid public health crisis. The consortium also accepts requests for education and training resources. Each state and territory has a designated team led by a Regional Technology Transfer Specialist, or TTS, who is an expert in implementing evidence-based practices. And now it's time to start the presentation. So welcome to our presenters.
Thank you, Crystal. My name's Jill McCracken, and I am, as Crystal said, the co-founder and co-director of the Sex Workers Outreach Project Behind Bars. We are an organization that works with incarcerated sex workers. We're a chapter of Sex Workers Outreach Project USA, which is a larger organization. And I am going to be talking today about the differences between consensual adult sex work and trafficking in the sex industry. Based on a human rights framework, I want to provide an overview of what those look like and some best practices of working with people who are working in the sex industry.
And my name is Magali Lerman. I am partner and co-founder with Reframe Health and Justice. We are an organization that is dedicated to shifting current socio-political paradigms related to race, gender, and bodily autonomy, including drug use and sex work. And a lot of what we do is really work on the intersection of those things, which is part of why I am really excited to be talking about this topic with you here today. Also, as a former survival sex worker and a person in long-term recovery, this is a topic that's really close to my heart. And so how our organization goes about addressing these matters is through capacity building assistance, policy development and analysis, and also thought work, organizational change work. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jill to go ahead and take you through some of these elements.
Thanks, Magali. So as I said, this is just a picture of me and some of my values and what I bring to SWAT Behind Bars. So thanks, Magali. So as I said, this is just an overview. This is the SWAT Behind Bars website and a little bit about me and what I bring to the conversation.
And that's me again. So I'll be presenting the second part of this presentation, but you'll see that we're collaboratively flowing together during our presentation.
Thanks, Magali. So this module is going to be covering sex work and trafficking in the sex industry. And as I stated before, we're looking at it from a human rights-based perspective. So we'll be talking specifically about what is sex work and a continuum of sex work in terms of where it exists in relationship to choice and coercion. And then we'll talk specifically about exploitation and trafficking in the sex industry and some of the challenges when these two concepts are conflated or considered to be the same. So I want to start by looking at values and how many people might think about sex work or prostitution or the sex trade. And so what we've done is we haven't created this. This is a values clarification regarding sex work. If you have the opportunity to click on the link, we actually have a form where you can fill out your scale of numbers, which I'll be going through shortly. If you don't have an opportunity to go to the other form, it would be great if you could think through this as I talk about it and think about where you stand in terms of your values related to sex work. So we start by thinking about identifying our own values and opinions, and you think about where you lie on this 1 through 5 continuum. 1 meaning absolutely that's crazy, and 5 meaning absolutely I agree with that, okay? So in order to take the time to think through this, I'm going to walk us through this values clarification chart. And I want you to think about where you would lie on this continuum between absolutely not and yes, I'm totally for this idea. Number 1, sex workers are riskier to have as partners than non-sex workers. I think I said sex workers are riskier to have as sexual partners than non-sex workers. Prostitution is exploitative and harmful. Many people become sex workers because they have been sexually abused as children. Prostitutes are mostly women. Doing sex work makes people feel unhappy and dirty. Most prostitutes can't wait to get out of the life. Pimps are violent and abusive people who exploit women. When relating to a sex worker who is my client, it's most important to help them get off the streets. Most organizations are happy to assist with sex workers and their needs. It's possible for anyone to get out of sex work. They just have to decide to ask for help. And finally, most sex workers use drugs. So I hope that you had an opportunity to think through where you lie in terms of your values and opinions in those 10 things. And we're going to be referencing them as we go through.
I'd like to add something.
Of course.
We will be doing a webinar with you all in a couple weeks here, and this is a really good activity to do in between now and then, as you'll see that a lot of the statements are absolutes. And what we're going to try to do today is unpack some of the nuance in these with you, but we really welcome folks bringing some of these and some questions you might have around these to our webinar to discuss with us in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Magali, for bringing that up. So we start with a human rights framework. We want to look at the human being at the center. So rather than looking at all of these activities or choices that people may make, we look at the human being in particular. And we look at rights, the rights of each individual person as the foundation. So when we think again about these different actions, well, what is going on with that individual person and what rights do they have available to them in the moment? I want to focus specifically on language and terminology because I think it's a helpful way of thinking about how we can put human rights together with some of these complex ideas. So for instance, when we think of prostitute/sex worker, the law is actually written as prostitution. We often hear people talk about prostitutes. I do not use that language, prostitute, to refer to an individual. In general, I do not use it because it refers to an action. It refers to a choice as opposed to an individual who may also be a daughter, a son, a wife, whatever. So sex work or sex worker was actually created, defined by a sex worker who wanted to create a term that reflected her positionality and her choice in choosing sex work as labor. And I tend to use that when I don't know how an individual person identifies. In general, I ask the person how they identify, and most likely they would not say prostitute, and most likely they do not say sex worker. But when I talk about it in general, for me, I feel like the term sex work gives more autonomy and choice. And then if there is exploitation, we will talk about trafficking or exploitation in the sex industry. So again, we can think about prostitution, sex work, trading sex. Oftentimes, people who are engaged in street economies will consider it, we're just trading sex. I'm trading sex for money, drugs, place to stay, whatever it is. So again, this language can actually be alienating, and I think it's really important to just get a sense of who your client is and how they identify. And finally, as I said, my language specifically, I use sex work to talk about it in general, and I will usually refer to a sex worker because I feel like it has more autonomy. So a human rights framework, first and foremost, respects the self-determination of the individual. And I think you guys are already doing that already, but I think it's really important to think about it in terms of, I don't know what's best for this individual. The individual knows what's best and what their goals are. And if we can come to the table as equals, and this also is represented in a harm reduction framework, if we can come to the table as equals and figure out where are the problems or where are the challenges, but this individual has self-determination. And what that also means is we then focus on and measure the progress through human rights outcomes. So as you can see on the slide, there's a list of many, not all of course. When you look at human rights-based outcomes, you're looking at housing, medical care, food, access to safe living and working conditions, a living wage, sexual health education, which I think is directly related to some of the areas of exploitation that people find themselves in because they aren't given sexual health education that is desperately needed. And finally, this framework directs resources towards programs that assist individuals in high-risk environments. And I want to draw attention to this language as well, because oftentimes we may say high-risk youth or high-risk individual, and most recently I've come across this language saying individuals who are living in high-risk environments. The high-risk environment is what places people in a problematic situation. The individual herself is not necessarily high risk. So again, that's one of those things that our language reflects how we view a potential problem or risky conditions or activities in which our clients may be engaged. A human rights-based framework also considers, as is outlined here on the slide, the impact of criminalized behaviors on individuals. So for instance, specifically drug use, sex work, prostitution. So what does it mean to be engaged in activities that are criminalized? And if you are engaging in activities that are criminalized, how then does a criminal record impact an individual's ability to provide safe living and working conditions? So once I have a criminal record, because I may have engaged in whatever these choices may be, now how am I going to navigate my own human rights and find work, a place to live? Those often become very challenging after one has a criminal record. And finally, I want to emphasize, as I'm sure you're aware, this concept of trauma and violence as factors that lead to substance use and abuse, or can lead to substance use and abuse, and other criminalized behaviors, and then incarceration. So it's very cyclical, and it's very difficult and can be very difficult to break out of that cycle. So I define sex work as a range of erotic labor. It is both legal and illegal, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. I define it as the exchange of sex or sexualized intimacy for something of value. It includes men, women, and trans individuals. All genders, sexualities can be engaged in sex work and are engaged in sex work. So when we say illegal and legal, some of the things that might come to mind, legal, erotic dancing or stripping, pornography, phone sex operators, cam people now, and illegal, prostitution within the U.S., outside of some counties in Nevada. So there are certain counties where prostitution is legalized. I also want to emphasize that there are the sex work and prostitution laws vary state by state. So I can't say that that's the only place where, the only aspect of sex work that is illegal. There are other aspects that can be considered illegal based on state by state.
Can I add something?
Of course, please.
I want to bring this to a place where folks who work with people in recovery can really understand that when we're talking about the sex trade, we're talking about a really vast industry. And so it's very similar to saying drug use. When I say drug use, what do I mean? You don't know, right? There's many different classes of drugs. There's many different types of drugs. There's many different ways that people, like routes of administration and ways that people do drugs. And so it's important to understand that, as Jill is talking about, that what we're talking about is a really vast industry. And so if someone says sex work or prostitution, really what does that mean?
Thank you. That's really important. So I want to come back to this concept of sex work and values, right? Oftentimes, I think when we see in mainstream media or conversations, we see that sex work is inherently exploitative, and sex workers are almost always considered to be victims. And again, I'm talking mainstream viewpoints and philosophies that no one could possibly choose sex work or prostitution, and that selling one's body is wrong. Now, you may not hold these values, but I'm just saying that these are often reflected in mainstream narratives around prostitution and trading sex. And what I want to emphasize here, and part of the goal of our whole talk today, is to say that these values in particular conflate adult consensual sex work and trafficking in the sex industry. So I want to switch gears briefly and define human trafficking. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was initially created in 2000, and it's been amended and it gets reauthorized every year or so. It defines trafficking as sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. It also defines it as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So it's important to know that trafficking, we may think of it in terms of drug trafficking or movement. A victim need not be physically transported from one location to another for the crime to fall within this definition. But what's most important to understand about this definition is we're looking at force, fraud, and coercion. And when it comes to the sex industry, any individual who's engaging in prostitution who is under 18 is automatically considered a victim of trafficking. So there are quite a few categories of trafficking. We in the United States have a tendency to focus a lot on trafficking in the sex industry, and there are actually many greater crimes committed in lots of other industries. So it's really important to think about trafficking as a broader problem. Trafficking basically includes forced labor and forced child labor, domestic, agriculture, factory workers, etc. It does include sex trafficking, trafficking in the sex industry, and child sex trafficking. It includes bonded labor or debt bondage, where there's a debt to be paid and you can never really get ahead or get out. and unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. So I want to just take a minute to deconstruct human trafficking. Within our society and our culture, we often hear volatile headlines or read volatile headlines that talk about sex trafficking. And I think that when we take this concept of human trafficking, which has a lot of different categories, and we narrow it down to sex trafficking, and we narrow that down to sex slavery, and then we narrow that down to all prostitution, that's a significant problem. Trafficking is framed almost exclusively as violence against women or sexual violence. This is problematic because, one, it pushes away all of labor trafficking, and two, it doesn't acknowledge the space for adult consensual sex work. As I just stated, it results in a decreased awareness of labor trafficking. It also negates racial, sexual, economic, and imperialist or colonialist violence against men, women, and transgender individuals. So we take this huge concept of trafficking, which is embedded in our complex systems, and we put it and narrow it around sex trafficking and often all of prostitution. And that is a significant problem, most especially for those of us who are working with people who are engaged in various aspects of the sex industry. I like to think about these things, again, from a human rights-based perspective and think about who is vulnerable to trafficking. Because people are vulnerable to being exploited when they cannot or do not have their basic needs met. So people who are excluded from labor protections. And this, in and of itself, is very apparent in adult consensual sex work. There are no labor protections because prostitution is illegal. Their marginal status often dictates the way people are exploited. For instance, if you are working in an agricultural field and you are not a citizen, you may be more apt to be exploited, right? So oftentimes we need to think about how are individuals vulnerable, and if we go back to, I'm not going to switch back, but if we go back to the human rights-based framework, if you don't have food and you don't have housing and you don't have safe living and working conditions, you're vulnerable to exploitation. So marginal statuses combined with lack of legal protection creates the conditions whereby trafficking can occur. Rather than focusing on, and we absolutely have to focus on individual victims and individual people who have been exploited in different environments, we also must look at the conditions that create these environments so that we can prevent them from happening in the first place. Finally, people without legal protection are vulnerable to traffickers because they are afraid of law enforcement, the criminal justice system or legal system, and other institutional bodies of power. So when we think about people who are engaging in the sex industry, and I very clearly own that I am not an expert on labor trafficking. I know that there is far more labor trafficking happening in our country than sex trafficking, and I think that's really important to note. But when it comes to people who are engaged in the sex industry, if they are facing an exploitative situation, they are afraid of law enforcement or sources that supposedly could help them, which further, I think, the criminal nature of adult consensual sex work further places them at risk for exploitation. Do you want to add something?
Yes, I'll add something. I feel like this is a good point to say that trafficking and exploitation are a possible negative adverse consequence of the sex trade, but even more so an adverse consequence of the current socio-political response to the sex trade. So it's very much like how overdose is a potential consequence of drug use or the socio-political response to drug use, but these two things are not the same, right? We cannot say that drug use and overdose is the same or that all people who use drugs will overdose, but rather we work with people who use drugs, we work with people on attaining recovery who want that, recognizing that overdose is something that we have to help them mitigate, even as a person who's in recovery, because we know that if they go back to using the same amount, they are even more vulnerable to overdose. And so that is how, when when we discuss sex work and we're working with sex workers, we recognize that we could potentially be working with trafficking survivors or could be working with someone who's vulnerable to trafficking, but that not every sex worker we're working with is such. And it's an important distinction to make.
Thank you for including that, which actually leads into the next big idea that there is a spectrum of choice and coercion that exists in the sex industry as well as other industries, right? So adult consensual sex work requires consent. There can be no force, fraud, coercion. That can be complicated because individuals' lives are complicated. Our lives are complicated. But trafficking of individuals for sex requires sexual violence, coercion, or the absence of consent. And again, as I've stated, these continuums of choice exist for individuals in manufacturing, agriculture, and domestic services, as well as others. So as Magali was saying, when we think about these continuums, we may have someone who is actively consenting to adult consensual sex work, and they could be victimized or exploited because of other marginalized conditions. So it spans a continuum. What I think is most important that we want to get across today is that conflating or making the two the same, prostitution and trafficking, is a significant problem, and it actually does harm to adult consensual sex workers and those who are being exploited and victimized. The Lancet, which is a well-known medical journal, did an issue on sex work and HIV, and the whole issue back in 2015 was to look at the impact of sex work, prostitution, and HIV. And one of their findings, I include the full quote here, quote, "Trafficking occurs in sex work as it does in other types of labor. However, the issue of trafficking in sex work has been singled out. Its scale and potential for harm frequently misstated or exaggerated to bolster anti-prostitution arguments, inflame public opinion, and justify repressive and counterproductive police action." We're working with people often who are on the margins, who are often criminalized for lots of different things, right? They are often profiled or whatever. And I think that this quote gets at some of that, that we live in a context and a culture that criminalizes certain bodies in certain ways more than other bodies. And what happens when we apply this to prostitution and we try to conflate prostitution with trafficking is that we miss out on a lot of potential needs and trying to prevent trafficking from happening in the first place. So conflating prostitution and trafficking does not differentiate between adult consensual sex work and exploitation. It silences the voices of adult consensual sex workers and individuals working in the sex industry. And I work with a lot of adult consensual sex workers on a daily basis, and they are happy to help contribute to policy and contribute to the conversation. And oftentimes their voices are silenced because of anti-prostitution values and the fact that many people will say everyone who's engaging in prostitution is always a victim and always exploited. And as the Lancet and many other bodies of knowledge have found, conflating these two undermines HIV and other STI prevention and treatment efforts. Finally, it shifts attention and resources from actual victims of trafficking in the sex industry. If we're focusing all of our attention on trying to criminalize and arrest adult consensual sex workers, and if we conflate these two, adult consensual sex work and trafficking, and say it's all trafficking, then those people who are actually not choosing it are pushed further underground. And that's a significant problem, which ultimately harms sex workers and victims of trafficking. There was an organization that I have recently become familiar with who actually has created this trafficking-free zone. And they want to go to different institutions or different cities and say, you can now be considered a trafficking-free zone if you follow these steps. And what I find problematic about that, and why I bring it to light as an example, is because a trafficking-free zone, in their mind, largely looks at training related to sex trafficking. So a city, like the one that I'm from, city of St. Petersburg in Florida, is now a trafficking-free zone. But most of what they're doing is focused on sex trafficking. They are not talking about the chains of labor where our chocolate is made, where our coffee is made, all of these other labor things get shoved aside, and we're focusing primarily on trafficking in the sex industry. And now we can claim a city is a trafficking-free zone. And that is incredibly problematic because we have just shoved all of these labor concerns aside. And we have also, in many ways, shoved adult consensual sex workers' experience and the value that they can bring to this conversation. I think it's important to acknowledge the different pathways that occur into the sex industry. And we think about this in some ways as the 3 C's. Choice, there are people who choose to go into the sex industry. Circumstance, it can be lack of access to resources, substance use or abuse, basic resources as you go along. People often can move in and out of the sex industry. And they can also, as we stated, based on other conditions that they're dealing with in their lives, move in and out of exploitative conditions or trafficking in the sex industry. And then finally, there is coercion, outright coercion, where people are saying, you will do this, and there is no choice. And so, especially when you all who are working so hard with different clients, it's really important to think about this spectrum. And when we think about self-determination, where would the individual that you're working with, how would they identify on this spectrum? Where would they place themselves? Because ultimately, it is about where they identify and what resources are available to them so that they can come to a place where they want to be. So I'm going to turn it over to Magali now, who's going to talk about best recovery practices for working with people in the sex trade.
Thank you, Jill. All right, so now that we have a bit of a better understanding of the basic mechanics of the sex trade and what a human rights framework to the sex trade looks like, I really want to start talking about the overlap between sex work and drug use and some of the sensitivities around working with people in the sex trade, including who use drugs or who are in recovery, including different ways to talk with your clients who are recovering and still working in the sex trade or exiting the sex trade, and some different bits of information or tips for working with people that you can give them to show them that you do care and that you are sex worker sensitive and that you want to hold whatever it is that they want for themselves. So when these two activities overlap, it's important to recognize what it is that people are getting out of these situations. And it's also important to recognize that both sex work and drug use can be either temporary or ongoing activities, right? So this could be, sex work could be what someone sees as their main source of income, or it could be something that someone does to be able to survive in certain moments. And same with drug use, right? Someone could be a binge-style drug user, someone could relapse, or someone could have been chronically using for whatever the past 3 years, 20 years. And so it's important to kind of hold those things. And so when we have to ask ourselves, why do people use substances when trading sex? And it's important to recognize that when we ask this question, a lot of times what we're talking about are psychosocial needs, versus if we flip this question, which we'll do here in a second, we're talking about economic needs. So when we ask the question, why use substances when trading sex, there's many reasons, and it oftentimes depends on potentially the substance or what people are getting out of using that particular substance. So to some folks, it helps boost libido. It could help enhance sexual experiences. For some folks, it's to stay awake, and especially if people are working the sex trade, if they're able to stay awake, they generally can make more money. It also helps suppress appetite, which could be for physical appearance reasons, or it could be for survival reasons because you need more resources to be able to eat. And for some people, of course, substance use is a very social activity. So it's something that they could use to be able to connect with other people, to connect with clients, etc. And of course, substance use for a lot of folks is self-care or numbing out. Going back to that social factor, it could be for partying. And then there could even be pressures, which is something we'll talk about how to help people navigate a little bit, around drinking or doing drugs with clients, or if someone works at a strip club or a legal part of the sex trade, there generally is a lot of substances that are related to those activities. And so there could be even manager pressure to drink with that client or to look like you're like a fun party person or a variety of different things. But these are some of the reasons why people would be using substances when they trade sex. But let's flip that question on its head and say, why trade sex when using substances? Because now we're talking more about economic needs. So to get more substances, money, and meet basic needs, right? Also, sex work is work that can be adapted to untraditional schedules, which is really helpful for people who have kids, which is also really helpful for people who have intense carceral control in their life, right? I think that you all are very aware that people who are on probation or parole oftentimes have to go drop UAs or meet with their probation officer several times a week, and it's really hard to hold a job around that. And so this is a job that can fit into a kind of non-traditional atmosphere that can raise and be flexible towards the person's needs. Also, to reduce stigma that occurs in the formal economy. And so if someone is using substances, there can be a lot of issues with holding a traditional job. And so if someone even is not using substances anymore, there can be a lot of stigma that's associated with like former drug use as well as sex work. And there's fewer restrictions regulating on the job substance use. And then, like I was saying before, it's often autonomous work, and so people, depending on what sort of engagement in the sex trade they have, sometimes people don't have to deal with a boss or a regulatory body or some of the things that can be really hard for some people to deal with. So it's important to recognize that these are often overlapping activities that carry a significant amount of stigma associated with the two. And so people are dealing with overlapping stigma as well. And oftentimes even the areas that work with either of those activities, right, aren't necessarily safe or affirming for the other activities. So if someone is involved in any sort of like sex worker rights groups, maybe that doesn't really understand recovery or abstinence that well, and vice versa, that sometimes recovery groups tend to be very like sex worker stigmatizing. And so people often have to hold back one part of themselves or don't feel completely safe. But when we're talking about sex work and substance use, we're talking about a spectrum of behavior and experience, right? We're not just talking about one thing. There's not one way that a sex worker who uses drugs looks like. Or a sex worker in recovery looks like. And we also know that abstinence is not the goal for everyone with both activities. And even if someone is a person who is in abstinence-based recovery, maybe they don't want to exit the sex trade, which would be an abstinence-based approach to the sex trade, or vice versa. And we also know that we have to use, like Jill was saying, a person-centered framework, that we know that drug use and sex work are really merely what someone does. It's not who they are. But because of the socio-political response to both these things, a lot of times people internalize these things as, what am I without my drug use? Or people just see me as a sex worker. Of course, they use words that aren't as human rights based when they say things like this. And so there are different ways that we can apply different frameworks to this. But really, we want to be able to prioritize autonomy and self-determination and informed consent and support people in working on what it is they want to work on. In terms of their recovery and in terms of navigating the sex trade or exiting the sex trade. And we know that these things both have complicated relationships, and that in and of themselves, drugs and sex are not always harmful, and that sex in and of itself, as a person recovers, is something that's their relationship to sex and sexuality is something that is going to evolve and change. And so if someone is involved in a sex trade, not only are they holding a evolving relationship to sex and sexuality, but also to labor and how they make and manage their resources. And this framework, this human rights or harm reduction framework, is actually really compatible with SAMHSA's guiding principles of recovery. I really love this wheel. This is a lot of how I define my own recovery as a person who lives a stable and purpose-filled life. That's what recovery means to me. And so we can see here that SAMHSA's guiding principles of recovery center hope and the idea that, that change is possible, or that living a stable and purpose-filled life is possible. And it's person-driven driven, right? And so we always want to let the person guide their own recovery and what that looks like, or their own involvement in the sex trade or exit from the sex trade and what that looks like. And that there's many different pathways for how that can look. And then it needs to be holistic. We really need to consider what we call, work a lot in public health, the social determinants of health, right? Or the social determinants of recovery, and all of the things that are involved in someone's life that really help determine that one thing. And also peer support, and that's one thing I'll be talking a lot about later when we talk about best practices, is that it's really helpful, and we know this in peer recovery coach models, right, to be able to work with people who have been through this before and understand. And there are a good amount of folks who are either current or former sex workers who are also in recovery. And so being able to find and connect to those networks, or even just networks of folks who are in the sex trade, can be really helpful, especially because compared to other jobs, it can be kind of isolating, because a lot of times it's very independent and autonomous work, and so it's nice to be able to meet other people. It's also relational. And it centers culture, and that's especially important to talk about when we're talking about folks who are in the sex trade, or folks of color, or who are queer or trans, or undocumented. There's many different ways that can look, but we know that there needs to be an element of cultural sensitivity and of centering culture, and that this addresses trauma, right? There is a large psychosocial factor, especially into substance use, and then also towards navigating stigma, and that it's really strength-based, and so we're recognizing the places where people are working towards their recovery, where they are making their basic needs and meeting their basic needs, and all the ways that they're doing that for themselves.
Can I add something to that conversation? I think that this wheel is also really, really helpful, because you can think about it in relationship to recovery. You can also think about it in relationship to sex work, as you've been talking about. I think one thing that's important to think about is the stigma, and the stigmas that overlap, and what people feel comfortable talking about when they are dealing with self-determination, when they are dealing with all of navigating these spaces. So one of the things that I like about this wheel is that it can be applied to both and that if we can think about working in the sex industry and being in recovery, or not being in recovery, or abstinence-based, then that can be a really helpful way of thinking through both of those complex overlapping issues.
Great, thank you. And now that we've talked about the why and the how, let's talk about the what. So what are folks who are in the sex trade concerned about, right? What are the things that, if you know that you're working with someone who is in or seeking recovery who's in the sex trade, what are the things that you could discuss with them, or to be able to help keep them safer, help them navigate the sex trade? So these are the occupational health and safety concerns. So a lot of them are infectious disease oriented, and that's going to be everything here on your left-hand side. Globally, sex workers experience 12 times higher rates of HIV than the general population, and a lot of times that is because of the socio-political response to the sex trade, combined with people's lack of access to resources, which mean that people have very few options to be able to keep themselves safe while making money. And we know that in many places, actually New York is not this case, because after 5 years, New York was the first state that was able to make it so that condoms cannot be used as evidence of prostitution, but in most states across the United States they can be, and so people don't want to carry condoms out of fear of being arrested. And then also, if someone just needs to be able to get inside for the night and needs to make a certain amount of money, and a client says, well, I'll pay you that amount of money if we have unprotected sex, then a lot of times people are put in a position where they're like, well, this is a possible consequence here, but how realistic is it, versus here is a moment and a way to make my needs right now. And so people are put in these positions all the time. And then also STIs similarly kind of follow suit, and there are many STIs, so this statistic is going to range, but we know that it's higher in the United States among people who trade sex, and then especially among people who trade sex and have been injecting drugs or using drugs. We know that hepatitis C is significantly higher in this population, and to be able to address this, there is hepatitis C prevention, as well as testing. I know that a lot of substance use treatment facilities now have partnerships with public health agencies where there is hepatitis C and HIV testing that's happening, and then New York State has one of the most robust hepatitis C treatment options available, although there's still lots of restrictions, but that's going to be really important for folks. being able to know about that and being able to navigate that. We also know that there are higher rates of mental illness among people who are in the sex trade, and a lot of times this is depression and anxiety that's a result of having to navigate some of the things that are related to highly criminalized and highly stigmatized activities. And we see that PTSD is actually 20% higher in this population, and a lot of times that has to do with the violence that occurs in the sex trade, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And that also because of the stigma, because of some of the mental illness and the violence and all of that, there are higher rates of suicide. And we see that there's different ways that this can be reduced. So if we continue here, we see that violence and overdose within the sex trade are really highly concerning and are found to be the top 2 causes of non-natural death in the sex trade. So the first being violence. There, in fact, is a day of international awareness around the violence in the sex trade, which is December 17th. And then that's followed by overdose, which is really high in the sex trade as well. And when we're talking about violence, it's important to recognize the many different sources that could be inflicting violence on people. And so a lot of times when we say violence in the sex trade, people think, oh, clients, which clients are, of course, a source. But there have been studies that actually show that client violence is actually lower related to some of the institutional harm that people experience. Harm from the police, peer, and community, especially intimate partner violence, is some of the highest, and then clients and pimps and managers. And so there's many different sources of violence in someone's life, and being able to navigate those is important.
If I can add something really quickly, there have also been quite a few studies. I'm thinking of Alexandra Lutnick's study, where she looked at people who are under 18 and engaged in the sex industry. And by far, they said their greatest source of violence was police officers, because there is that impunity against being found out for the violence that they're engaging in, because police officers feel like they can take whatever they want. And so I just want to emphasize that this is not only for adults and that it is not primarily clients, but it can be used against youth as well, which is incredibly problematic.
Yeah, thank you. And that's important to recognize for those of you who are working with youth. And in a bit, I'll talk about some of the other considerations, because it really is a completely different ballgame, right, when you're working with youth. So some of the sources of mental distress that people are experiencing is the fact that many times people are living dual identities. In fact, it's one of the ways that people can stay safer in the sex trade is if they do have an alternate identity that they work under and that they meet people under, because that keeps them safer in case anyone decides to stalk them or anything like that. But it means that they are always kind of hidden in some regard. And then the stigma is incredible, the criminalization is incredible, and there's large amounts of trauma that come along with all the things I've just talked about. And so these next couple slides are going to talk about some of the ways in which people have learned to navigate these occupational health and safety concerns. And these are things that you can discuss with your clients who are in or seeking recovery, who are also in the sex trade. Some of the ways to potentially be able to keep themselves safer or healthier while they are working on their recovery, right? So they don't have to be triggered by different elements of the sex trade or different boundary issues while navigating things with people. So here are some tips for staying safe while working. So one of the biggest ones is not to work in secluded areas, or to always have a safety buddy, someone who knows that the person is going to be with someone, and maybe some details about the client, when the client should end. So hey, even if that ends up being like you as a case manager, and the person's outpatient and saying something like, you know, I actually am going to see a client tomorrow, and I'd really love to be able to check in with you tomorrow about it. And that's a good way for you to be like, yeah, okay, how do you feel about your recovery in this moment after seeing that person? And so there's many different ways that you can engage with people around this. It's important to recognize, and I'll talk about this here in a bit too, that disclosure doesn't necessarily come easily, right? People might not want to disclose to you that they are in the sex trade, and that's because there's a high level of stigma. And a lot of times people have trouble holding that if they're trying to stop one activity, that not stop stopping or how to stop another when their basic needs and resources aren't being met can be hard for them. But also being able to help people recognize that they shouldn't give out their real name, or being able to have conversations with them around like what that means and feels like for them, especially as they're working towards being able to uplift transparency and honesty in their recovery. And then also screening clients whenever possible. And so this is a mechanism that people have been using for a long time to be able to keep themselves safe, to be able to have some information about the client that they can then run through national or local databases where other people who have seen a client who might be violent or exploitative or fraudulent can report that person as such. And so that's a way that sex workers have been able to keep themselves safe for a long time, is to create that community network that can tell each other that. And so if you are working with someone who had been a street-based sex worker who is now trying to go online or trying to navigate things differently for themselves in a way that maybe is like less negatively impactful on their recovery, being able to know like, hey, here's a way that you can keep yourself safe is important. Also, and this is really important for folks being able to kind of uplift and center their voice and being able to navigate boundaries. But if someone is pushy, if someone's trying to negotiate price or trying to have sex without any sort of protection, that the person could be aware of that a person, because if they're pushy now, they're probably just going to be pushy all the way through, which could be potentially harmful for many reasons, but especially if that person becomes pushy around wanting to party together, right? Also, for people who are BDSM or kink providers, getting trained in more dangerous fetishes such as asphyxiation or needle play, being able to have some training, and there's a lot of different places that people can go in the community to get that. And if you're not aware of those resources, or they aren't, connecting with a local or national sex worker health and rights organization can help that person advance in those ways and also find community. And I list some of those in the resources at the end. And so here are some tips for staying healthy, right? So safety is a primary concern, and so is health. So being able to help people understand how they can navigate and negotiate condom use, how they can carry condoms. There's also other ways of preventing HIV, primarily PrEP, which is a once-a-day pill that prevents HIV. There's also now event-based PrEP, where if someone is going to be doing something where they're in a very high-risk environment, they can take PrEP a couple days beforehand and afterwards. And again, partnerships with public health agencies will help get access to that. Also, prevent infections by drinking lots of water and peeing right before and after sex. That can be helpful for people. I think the number one tip I give anyone who uses drugs or trades sex or any of it is just stay hydrated. Carrying wet wipes and mouthwash to use between dates is important for folks, and then washing sex toys and yourself with soap and water. And then considering what sort of underwear a person wears to be able to prevent any sort of like bacterial or yeast infection, and being able to have a good relationship with, or at least know where a clinic is if they're experiencing pain or if they think something is wrong. And then especially as people who are substance use case managers or peer recovery specialists, a lot of your job, right, is to help people understand how to take care of their emotional health and how to develop self-care strategies that don't include substance use, right, or include less problematic substance use, or however they want that to look for themselves. So this could be strategies like baths and affirmations, listening to music, meditation, yoga, working out, being around friends and family that are drama-free and feel safe. And so really being able to navigate any sort of interaction with people or any sort of work environment is important, but recognizing that this work environment is highly stigmatized, is completely unregulated. Most of the time, some legal portions of the sex trade are regulated, but still highly stigmatized. And so being able to have those conversations with people is important. And so in that vein, here are some tips for people in recovery who trade sex. So trading sex for money is safer than trading sex for drugs or valuables, and that is helpful for people who might have been doing the latter. And so recognizing that now that they are having a different relationship with substances, that being able to trade sex for money instead is something that could actually help increase their livelihood and decrease the amount of violence that they're experiencing, if they are experiencing violence. And that if their client is engaging in substances, that's something to pay attention to, or maybe they don't want to have any sort of interaction with clients who engage in substances. I have a friend who is still working and is in recovery, and she says very clearly on her website that she's in recovery and that she requires all her clients to come to their engagements completely sober, just like not intoxicated. She won't tolerate that. And so there's absolutely ways that people can navigate being in recovery and still engaging in the sex trade. And one of the ways that people can really uplift their recovery while engaging in the sex trade is just by having a hard line that they are avoiding drugs that are offered by clients, and that's a really good way to navigate around that, is just be like, oh, I don't know where that came from, and I'm sorry, I just don't do these things when offered by clients, and I might do this on my own time if they don't want to disclose that they're in recovery. Also knowing that mixing drugs can be really problematic, but that Viagra in particular, which is a legal drug that we don't think about a lot, can be especially risky when combined with other substances. And so that's a way that people can like navigate out or around some of those interactions as well. And then people who are working at clubs and recognizing that drinking in particular is something that's highly associated with legal portions of the sex trade, that there's a lot of different things that they can do to try to navigate around drinking or drink less, including using a code word with a bartender to already have an agreement ahead of time that, I'm actually going to be drinking non-alcoholic drinks, but when I order, a rum and Coke, that actually just means like a Coke with grenadine, right? And so being able to have those relationships ahead of time, or just asking for more mixer or pouring drinks out when the customer isn't looking.
Can I add something to that conversation? I just want to emphasize that so much of this that you're talking about is self-determination. It's the individual who's deciding where they want to go, what kind of sex work they want to be engaged in, and how they can navigate their recovery. I also want to emphasize that that is also a more and less privileged position, right? As people who are working with people who are engaged in these different economies, it's really important, as we both talked about, have self-determination and to honor that self-determination in the client. I think that it's also really important to think about we don't always have all of the choices that are available to us or that we would want to have available to us. And that's related to what socioeconomic structures are available to us and resources that are available to us. So
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And we're also recognizing that people have many different ways that they can engage in the sex trade. And so as they are entering recovery or as their recovery evolves, maybe the type of sex work they were doing before isn't the type of sex work they want to be doing now, et cetera. But that involves an incredible amount of choice and access to certain things, right? You need to have an ID to be able to work in a club.
Right.
Also, if a customer or client is pressuring someone to use, there's many different ways that they can make that about their work and the interaction that don't involve having to disclose their recovery, or that they don't do drugs at all, or engage in substances at all if that's something that's true for them. So making it about the client and making it about the encounter, saying something like, oh, I don't want to get too sloppy, I want to be my best for you, like, this is about this thing, it's not really about this. And people can put that into kind of their own words and their own persona that they're projecting and all of that. And so I know someone whose recovery still includes some substances but doesn't include Coke, which was her drug of choice. And so she tells people that Coke actually takes her libido away and they wouldn't want that. And they're always just like, oh yeah, I wouldn't want that. And so that's how she navigates that.
Can I say something? One of the things that I want to draw attention to, which I think is so valuable about the tips, is that when people that are working with people in street economies are offering these tips, it's sending a message that it's okay what you do. It's okay to be a sex worker. It's okay to be engaged in using substances. Where do you want to be? What is your self-determination? What are your goals? And I think that that can be really helpful with having these tips, that this person that you're working with is on your side. They're trying to help you navigate in a way that makes the most sense for you, the individual. So I just want to emphasize how powerful I think these tips can be, because when you work with your client and you offer some of these recommendations, it can really make them feel like we're in partnership, as opposed to you telling me what I need to be doing to get in a better place.
Right. Thank you, Jill, for pointing that out. I think also that really shows that that providers or case managers are coming from a place of support rather than judgment, and so you're not here to try to tell people how to live their lives and what's good or bad. You're here to support them in primarily their recovery, but being able to find and live a life of recovery that fits into a life that they want to live or that they need to live in this moment, right? So thank you. That's a really good point. And with that, these next slides talk about some of the considerations for sex workers seeking recovery, and these are some of the questions that you can ask people who are in or seeking recovery who are engaging in the sex trade or who might want to exit the sex trade. These are some of the questions that you can ask them to really be able to get into some of those fruitful conversations and to really be able to lead towards different interventions with them and to help them understand what their relationship to sex work while being a person in recovery is. So the first is, what is or was the relationship between your substance use and sex work? Really helping people think through that and really helping people understand that for them. And also so you can understand it, so you know how to work with them. Because if someone is interested in exiting the sex trade and is no longer participating in the sex trade, maybe a bunch of the tips that I just offered are not going to be the place that you want to meet them, right? Maybe trying to figure out how to help them connect to people who are both former drug users and sex workers is going to be more helpful. Is the type of work you were doing before a trigger? Right? And what about it? And so really trying to think, is the issue hardship with setting boundaries with clients, or is it actually something directly related to the substance itself? Because a lot of times people know that they have an aversion to something, or there's a trigger in there, but the trigger might not be sex work. The trigger could potentially be clients who push that person around not using condoms or protection or something like that. So being able to define what exactly it is, I feel like this is what I have to do in therapy just about every other week. Like, what is the issue really? And also, would you like to stop or reduce working in the industry, or would you like to explore other parts of the industry where there's less exposure to substances? So really helping a person understand that, and again, that's going to help you understand that so you can meet them where you're at or they're at. And how comfortable are you telling clients that you are in recovery, and what are your feelings about doing so? So that way you can explore interactions they might have with clients, or being able to help them discuss their reality as a person who's in recovery. And so these are things that people are going to need to be thinking about, right, when they are in recovery and engaging in the sex trade. Who do you have in your life that is affirming of your work and your recovery, right? Because like I said before, you might find people who are affirming of your recovery and are like, oh, a lot of times people think that engaging in the sex trade, it means that they are walking a thin line and that they're just like, you know, essentially at risk of relapse, when that's not actually true, right? Again, it could be that this person needs to work on setting boundaries, right? So a person's presence in the sex trade is not a relapse risk. Absolutely not, but a lot of people think that, and so that could be something that means they don't feel affirmed if they're talking about that in recovery communities. And likewise, if they're always hanging out with sex workers who are like partying all the time, not like all sex workers do, but they're not, they might not feel like their recovery is being supported, and so finding places and people that are affirming of both these things at the same time. And then what is your non-judgmental support system? What does that look like? What is involved, who's involved, and being able to talk about that with them. It's important to recognize that when having these conversations that there's actually many barriers to accessing non-judgmental support systems and accessing services in and of themselves, to starting with the fact that most shelters and housing programs don't allow sex work. And so if someone is staying at a housing program or staying at a shelter, they still need to be able to make money or meet basic needs or pay for treatment or whatever that looks like. And then if they're staying there and they're not allowed to do sex work, that actually most of the time means that they can't stay there, or they can't advance whatever it is they're trying to advance, because they're literally not allowed to meet their basic needs. There's a lot of times requirements to stop trading sex to participate in services. There's incredible amounts of stigma within healthcare and social service settings, which include shaming. It also can include misgendering or orienting people. It can include outing as well. And so it's important, and I'll talk about this a bit later, but it's important to tell people what confidentiality looks like at your agency and what disclosure potentially means. Am I telling you this, and am I telling just you, or am I telling you and now your whole team knows, or now your whole agency knows? These are important things for people to know. And also we know that it only takes one bad experience, right, with a social service or healthcare provider for someone to never want to disclose again. So really being able to hold that for people. Also, age and medical coverage restrictions are a big barrier, and fear of disclosure to law enforcement and mandatory reporting. So even if there's the presence of police or security, a lot of times people make that mean a lot of different things. So again, being able to talk about what confidentiality looks like and what possibly disclosing means, especially for people who have children or might be minors, and that there's a lot of fear of outing because it's pretty founded. A lot of people are outed, and that can be really hard for people. And then we know that a lot of times empowering and safe spaces aren't tailored for don't do outreach to sex workers. And so there might not be a specific space where people feel affirmed in that regard. And all these things lead to people being less likely to disclose that they are involved in the sex trade, or that sometimes they trade sex for resources. So in this next section, we're going to talk about best practices for listening to sex workers and talking with sex workers, because we know that a lot of times people are now comfortable about talking about substance use, but maybe not sex work, especially if it's not something that you've encountered before or done yourself. So how can you talk about sex work with sex workers? The first important thing is creating a safe space. And so I've said this before, and I'll say this again: make confidentiality and possible disclosure clear. What does that mean? What does that look like? What might not that look like? And then also collaborating with existing organizations and outreach workers who connect with the community. We can't be all things for all people, so understanding where there are partnerships or being able to refer someone out is really important. And Jill talked about the importance of normalizing and neutralizing language. I will say that a lot of times I really try to see how people refer to themselves, and that might not be the way that I refer to them. A lot of times sex workers call themselves hoes or hookers, and that might not be how I want to reflect their language, but recognizing like this is how someone refers to themselves, where is this coming from, does that seem like they have a lot of internalized stigma around it, and saying, oh, okay, I hear you saying this, is it okay if I say sex work? I hear that that is a good way to talk about this, right? And so having that conversation and recognizing most people don't consider themselves sex workers. I have a lot of former clients who just had a lot of boyfriends, right? Or who just had a lot of overnight experiences with men or people. And so starting to recognize what that might mean or what this could look like. And hiring members of the community, hiring people who are in recovery who have also had experiences in the sex trade and can talk about that with clients, with your clients. And offering services and resources that are specific to the sex trade are also going to be really important. So like Jill said earlier, even being able to have conversations about sex work and providing some very tangible tips for how people can keep safe or healthy shows people that you care. Here are other ways to show people that you care, and this is a safe place to be as a sex worker who's in recovery. So peer support meetings, really specialized. We know that there are meetings for queer and trans people in recovery. There are meetings for men and women in recovery. There are meetings for youth in recovery. And so absolutely there can be meetings for sex workers in recovery. But but also what does that mean? Because that might not be a space that people want to be seen going into, so being able to create a very sensitive space around that.
If I could add something to that, I think that part of creating a safe space is also acknowledging the expertise of your client. And you just made a nod to this, right? So sometimes we talk about clients of sex workers, and then we're talking about your clients that you're working with. So I just want to make that distinction. And I think that when you're working with specific clients, you value their expertise, and they are teaching you simultaneously as you are trying to engage with them in terms of whatever it is, their recovery, their goals, their whatever. And I constantly push and say we need to have people who are directly engaged in whatever these communities are at the forefront. We need to pay them for their expertise. So for instance, talking about hiring people, I just want to emphasize that every individual that is working with your clients are able to learn from the expertise that they have about these issues. It's a process.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. And also I know that there are mobile units and outreach units that you all are doing, which are really great ways of connecting with people and being able to offer support to people who aren't able to actually make it into our services. And that's a really good place to plug peers who are in the sex trade in as well, especially when doing outreach to places where there might be a lot of sex workers. And then being able to have these knowledge building resources, including those safety tips. So in those mobile efforts or in your office where you're talking with people, even having a handout, something that's hopefully pretty that incorporates a lot of the tips and is like, oh, okay, you know, it sounds like maybe you are doing different things to be able to meet your basic needs or resources, and this is something that we have for people. Maybe it's you, maybe it's not, right? Or if someone's disclosed, hey, I have this, being able to have those things around, which really leads me to my next slide, and this point on normalizing, right, and being able to have sex work positive posters or handouts, etc., in your space, which really shows people, oh, maybe this is something I can talk about here. It's important too not to profile. I think a lot of times we miss people that way when we think that like, oh, I'm not going to talk to a guy about sex work, right? We know that regardless of someone's sexuality, they do a lot of things to be able to get drugs, right, or to be able to stay high when that's something that it is that they're doing. And I used to work at a syringe service program, and we did have groups for folks who were both in the sex trade and used drugs. And even I was surprised by the large amount of guys who were coming saying like, yeah, this is actually something I'm doing and it's something I want to talk about. And so being able to just normalize this and have these conversations with everyone helps combat a lot of the stigma around it and helps people who are engaging in both activities be able to talk about it. And building trust with people. It takes a while to have a relationship with someone so that someone might want to disclose this or talk about this, and being able to connect people with leadership development opportunities and opportunities to be able to talk about these things or live in a way that feels really good to them. So again, sometimes outsourcing is the way to go. And in terms of participant engagement, talking with folks about how they make money and survive is a really good lead into being able to have conversations about sex work with people. Sex doesn't always have to be the focus. Maybe that's something people want to talk about a lot, and maybe it's not, right? And so really knowing that there's many different entry points into being able to have this conversation with people, and that your comfort helps determine their comfort. And so it might be a little uncomfortable at first, and just recognizing that the more you do this, the more comfortable you'll be talking about this, or recognizing that if there's a lot of resistance in you, maybe you have a colleague who's way better at talking about sex with people than you are, right? So maybe it's not you, but just being able to understand like what your relationship is to talking about sex work and sex with participants, and staying informed. So prostitution laws are very, very localized. There are absolutely federal and state-based restrictions to take into consideration, but knowing the barriers in your area. Does your area have any sex worker sensitive services? Does it not? Does it have trafficking services or services for folks who are exiting? It's important to recognize what is available in your area and also what the barriers are in your area. And it's important to make violence prevention as much of as a priority as overdose prevention for these folks, right? So absolutely overdose is something to be concerned about, but also violence is something that they are trying to reduce and prevent and navigate every single day. And so having those conversations with people is very important. And recognizing that sometimes just throwing services or trying to connect people to services can be even more of a overwhelming for them or a barrier in their life, because what they need is resources, right? And so if someone is trying to exit the sex trade, or someone is engaging in the sex trade, saying like, oh, you know, go to this place where you can go to a focus group, or all those things isn't necessarily helping them meet the thing they need to meet, which is being able to make money and to be able to survive. And so there's a lot of other things that could be taken into consideration if a person wants to exit the sex trade. Like, how are they going to be able to transition employment into kind of the formal economy? And then also people need safe places to work, which is something to think about for people and when working with people. And there are some safer forms of sex work. And so what are people's main concerns, right? Are people's main concern anonymity? Anonymity is people's main concern HIV prevention. And so whatever that is, that could determine what part of the sex trade they're working in. And that also there's community-based resources. And so what are those for people? And as a service provider, there's some important things to recognize need to be taken into account when having these conversations, right? Of course, there's always some liability. So where are minors involved? Because like Jill was saying before, a minor involved in the sex trade is a victim of trafficking with or without the presence of a third party. And so that means a lot of things in terms of your working with them. It also means a lot of things in terms of the resources that are available to them. And where is mandatory reporting a concern, and being able to uphold that or just take that into consideration. And then we see kind of the movement of the war on sex trafficking really mimic the movement of the war on drugs. And a lot of what that looks like is the criminalization of some safety and health information. So recognizing what that is in your area, and where essentially being able to like sensitively work with people in the sex trade could put you or your organization at risk. In New York, there's not a lot that I know of, but just being able to recognize that sometimes that's an issue. And for service providers, like I said, staying informed and recognizing that consciousness evolves, and that the more you have these conversations with people, the more that you understand or know about the sex trade, right? Like your feelings will evolve about this as well, which is important to recognize, because we work to be neutral, but that doesn't mean we are neutral, right? We just don't show judgment and work with people, but a lot of times we do have our own feelings about things, and that's normal, and that will evolve. And so here are some resources for you all. These are going to be important in being able to give to your clients who are in the sex trade. And these are the national resources. So like Joe was saying, she works for an organization that is closely related to the Sex Worker Outreach Project USA. I'm actually currently the president of the Sex Worker Outreach Project USA. They are a national network of current and former sex workers, as well as allies who work to uplift the basic human rights of folks in the sex trade through education and advocacy. And they have local chapters across the United States. I believe that there's one or two in New York as well, but you could go to their website at www.swapusa.com to see if there is a chapter near you. There's a chapter map. And then Jill had talked some about SWAP Behind Bars. There's also the Desiree Alliance, which holds a conference every year, which has a lot of safety information and advocacy information, all sorts of stuff, which is helpful for folks themselves and sometimes also people who are working with folks. And then there is my agency as well, which oftentimes acts as a bridge between government or community-based organizations and people themselves.
If I can jump in, I just wanted to emphasize that SWAP and SWAP Behind Bars both have an 800 number, or they are the same 800 number. And we did not put this on the resources, but we're happy to share that in the webinar. We're happy to share that in whatever capacity. It can be really helpful for you as a provider. It can also be very helpful to refer to your clients. So I just wanted to say there is one-on-one help. And you are also welcome to reach out to both of us if you have questions. And of course, the webinar will be addressing questions that you have as well.
Thank you, Jill. Yeah, and that 1-800 number is on the website that I just gave you as well, Swap USA's website.
Oh, I did want to say, I think it's swapusa.org. And Swap Behind Bars is the same. It's just swopbehindbars.org. So
Thank you.
they're really easy to find.
Thank you. And here are some New York-based groups. Of course, most of these are New York City. So the Sex Workers Project provides case management and legal resources to victims of trafficking and survivors of trafficking, as well as people who are currently involved in the sex trade. GLITZ is a housing program and a support program for transgender sex workers. And Safe Horizons has a really robust anti-trafficking program, as well as different shelters and all sorts of stuff. And are very good at working with people in the sex trade. I will say that a lot of New York groups generally are, because there used to be something called the PROS Network, which was a group of people that would train social service and health and legal providers in New York City and support them on being certified as sex worker sensitive. That hasn't been happening for a long time now, but I know the Anti-Violence Project and others have been trained previously, and so there is a higher level of sex worker sensitivity across social service providers in New York City and then just about anywhere else in the country other than Chicago. Chicago is probably best right now. But and here's some other resources if you're interested in being able to know more about the conversations we had today. St. James Infirmary, which is a clinic for and by sex workers in San Francisco, has an occupational health and safety guide. So if you're interested in some of those tips, some of those considerations, that's a really good place to look. And also the Global Network of Sex Worker Projects has really amazing research and can really talk about some of the nuances of the sex trade, some of the barriers that people in the sex trade face if you're interested in understanding more about that. And then for any sort of continued training or support on advocacy or support with community building resources, Reframe Health and Justice is here, as is Swap Behind Bars. And so you have all of our information there. I want to say thank you so much to OASAS for the opportunity to come work with you all. We look forward to this webinar. I will say that this is something where we want you to be able to use this content. Please, we want it to go viral. Share it with people in your organization. Share it outside. We do ask that you reference our organizations when you do that. And then here is the Learning Thursday evaluation. Your feedback is absolutely appreciated. And then did you have an evaluation as well in here?
Well, there's two. So if you look at the top one, I believe, is my evaluation, and the second one is to look at Magali's evaluation, and then I think there's a quiz and something that's specifically for OASAS. So yeah, anything that you can do there would be greatly appreciated. I also want to emphasize that we see this as sort of a jumping off point where we're providing a lot of information in a couple of hours. The webinar is designed to then try to kind of mesh through some of these questions and answers, but we're happy to talk to people as we move forward and provide additional resources. And again, Magali included a lot of resources that are both national and international. And the Global Network of Sex Work Projects is absolutely incredible in terms of the resources that it provides. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested.
And we know that we just threw a lot of information at you, and so we are looking forward to you all processing it. And please bring your questions or even your comments to us when we have this webinar. We really look forward to meeting with you. So thank you for your time today.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you to OASAS. And also, if you want to, we've included our email addresses on these slides. If you want to send questions in advance prior to the webinar for our consideration, we're more than happy to look at them, and then we'll address them during the webinar. So thanks so much for your participation.
I want to thank our presenters for today's program. I hope you'll find it useful while assisting clients in need of services and recognizing the needs of a diverse patient population. Your feedback is important to us. It helps us know if we are meeting your educational goals and expectations. Once you have viewed the presentation in its entirety and completed the quiz, please follow directions to access the SurveyMonkey website and take a moment to complete the evaluation. Once again, thank you for joining us, and keep up the good work.